Good evening. Good evening and welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to what is Professor Neil Brenner's inaugural lecture here at the GSD. I can't tell you how delighted I am, as indeed are so many of our colleagues here at the GSD, for the fact that Neil Brenner has joined us here at the school at the beginning of this academic year, and has already, despite a sabbatical period, has jumped into all sorts of roles and responsibilities and is really engaging with the school and with the university in a wonderful fashion, and will be actually teaching classes as of next semester. The appointment of Neil Brenner together with that of Diane Davis, I think in a very short period of time, adds to the incredible strength that already exists in the area of planning and urban design in the school, and really demonstrates our commitment to the evolution and the enhancement and the expansion of the department, specifically in areas related to more theoretical and conceptual areas of urbanization, urban theory, urban studies. One of the issues that I think is particularly pertinent is the relationship between spatial issues and political issues, in a way, and the relationship between the political and spatial. And I think this is a theme and an area that is obviously of incredible relevance to those people who are studying planning and urban design, but really to the rest of the GSD community, people who are involved in the fields of architecture and landscape architecture. I feel that in the coming years we will see a much greater relationship between UPD and really the rest of the school. Neil Brenner's appointment here at the GSD is as Professor of Urban Theory, and he will probably speak to us more about some of the plans that he has. But in fact, in the context of the research programs here at the school, Neil will be beginning or developing an urban theory lab at the GSD. And this also is, in a way, part of a commitment to developing areas, for example, connected to geography, urbanization, sociology, urban theory more broadly. And I think this is also very exciting for the school to engage more theoretically with urban issues. Neil's writing and teaching focuses on the theoretical, conceptual, and methodological dimensions of urban questions. His work builds upon and seeks to extend the fields of critical urban and regional studies, comparative geopolitical economy, and radical sociopolitical theory. And to focus on these themes, also Neil has done an incredible amount of writing. His book, New State Spaces, Urban Governance and the Rescaling of Statehood, was published by Oxford University in 2004. And he has written and co-edited a number of other books, including Cities for People, Not for Profits, Critical Urban Theory and the Rights to the City, Henri Lefebvre, State, Space, World, co-edited with Stuart Eldon, Global Cities Reader, Urban Restructuring in North America and Western Europe, and the list goes on. I think we're extremely delighted that Neil is here and discussing the de-urbanization question tonight with us. So please welcome Professor Neil Brenner.
So can you guys hear me? Is this on? Testing. Is it on? Okay, great. Moisen, thank you for that introduction, and I would also just like to thank really everyone at the GSD for welcoming me here. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a very exciting place to do urban research, and I'm going to try to explain tonight some of the projects that I'm going to try to undertake. while I'm here. And also, before I begin, I would just like to thank my parents who are actually in the audience tonight, which is a special thing for me. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's actually the first time that I've had them here. So this lecture is an attempt to reflect on the contemporary situation and the challenges of the field that we've come to know as urban studies. Now, the parameters of this field of urban studies have always been quite fluid. They span the social sciences, the humanities, the planning and design and architectural disciplines. But I want to argue that it's both possible and indeed necessary to treat this field of urban studies as a relatively coherent set of epistemologies and cartographies of social life. So there are certain shared assumptions about the field and about the space of the urban that really underpin the field as we have inherited it from the 19th century. The field of urban studies basically emerged in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century as a form of organized social inquiry and intervention during a period of capitalism basically in which very large-scale metropolitan regions were forming. So the big cities, places like Chicago, Berlin, and so forth, were forming, and meanwhile major transformations of the countryside were going on in conjunction with the industrialization of agriculture and the dispossession of rural populations. So from this point of view, it's intelligible enough, it seems to me, that the field of urban studies has tended to focus on the big cities, the large metropolises, as its major intellectual focal point. Indeed, the assumption that urban studies is and should be the study of cities is so pervasive that it might be compared to the way that coin collectors and stamp collectors think about what they do. In the same way that coin collectors collect coins, that's what a coin collector is, and stamp collectors collect stamps, nothing against any coin collectors or stamp collectors in the room, but so too, urbanists should collect, or as it were, investigate cities. What else could possibly justify the existence of a field of study that's urban studies? So oftentimes when I meet non-academic friends, they say, well, what do you do? I'm an urban studies professor. The next question, like 9 out of 10 times, is what cities do you study? Entirely reasonable on some level. Well, tonight and in the work that I'm going to be doing here for the medium term and maybe long-term future, I will be arguing precisely against this assumption. It may have been plausible to think of urban studies as the study of cities when Engels was studying Manchester in the 1840s, and it might have been more or less plausible to do the same thing, to make the same assumption, when Burgess and Park were studying Chicago in the 1920s, and it was maybe still intelligible in the 1970s when David Harvey was studying Baltimore, and maybe even in the 1990s when Saskia Sassen was studying Tokyo and London, New York. Urban studies is the study of cities. But I want to argue that the assumption that urban studies entails the study of cities is today basically obsolete. We live in a new formation of capitalist space-time that has totally exploded the simple urban-rural division that the field of urban studies has long presupposed either explicitly or implicitly. And it's basically rendered the category of the city highly problematic, or as I'm going to try to argue tonight, basically ideological. In the 1970s, Henri Lefebvre, who's been a real inspiration for a lot of the work that I've been doing, he spoke of an explosion of spaces. And he suggested that inherited formations of place, territory, and scale are being radically rewoven in relation to broader transformations of capitalism, state power, and social and political struggle. And basically, so this is now almost 4 decades later, I think Lefebvre had it right. I mean, he wrote this, he introduced this phrase sometime in the early 70s. I think Lefebvre had it right, but his observation over 4 decades ago doesn't really answer anything for us. It poses a challenge. For anyone concerned to understand the spatial organization of the world today, I think this idea of the explosion of spaces is a fundamental challenge. And basically, the challenge is this. We need to reinvent our categories of analysis to render them more adequate to the types of sociospatial transformations that have been unfolding around the world across territories, across places, and across scales. So how do we, it's not just an empirical question, how do we map the world? It's, for me, at core, a conceptual question. It's a question that demands forging new categories of analysis for thinking about space at all scales, across places, and across territories. So let me be clear at the outset, I do think that urban studies can and should be relevant to both thought and action in the world today, in the social sciences and the humanities, and certainly in the planning and design and architectural disciplines. So I'm not saying let's throw it out and move on to something else. So what I want to suggest is that we need to reinvent the framework for thinking about this field. But again, the challenges from my point of view, and I'll try to flesh this argument out in the next half an hour or so, the challenges are not just empirical. Yes, we need to do more research. But in order to do that research coherently, we need to develop appropriate categories of analysis. And that entails a lot of thought, both about the inheritance of the field of urban studies that we inherit from the 19th and early 20th century, but also about the present, about the contemporary situation, both intellectually, politically, and otherwise. So Moisen mentioned the Urban Theory Lab, which is a project that I'll be initiating basically at the beginning of the next semester. And I like this idea of the lab, which I think Hashem Sarkis and others at the school has introduced. And for me, the idea of an urban theory lab, it may sound like a contradiction in terms, because usually the notion of a lab, like in the hard sciences, it implies empirical research. Like you test hypotheses and you do research, and that's obviously fundamental to what we're doing at the school as well. But I like the idea of a theory lab, because the idea is that we're not just doing empirical research, but we're also doing, as it were, conceptual experimentation. We need to experiment with concepts. And it's something that I've been trying to argue for a long time, even when I was in graduate school, that the work of theory is as foundational to the enterprise of urban scholarship as is the work of concrete empirical research. Of course, there's a dialectic between them. But sometimes, particularly in more positivist circles, one has to really make a strong argument for the importance of theory. So that's also part of what I'll be bringing to, well, certainly it'll see what you think of the argument here, and it's going to be an agenda for a lot of the teaching that I'll do at the school. And one more sort of prefatory comment. So I'm going to teach, alongside the Urban Theory Lab, one of my classes next semester will be a seminar on planetary urbanization. And in some sense, this lecture is both like an overview of what I hope the Urban Theory Lab will try to explore. These are some of the questions we're going to try to explore. But this is also, in effect, an introduction to what that seminar will be about. I think I'm probably going to cap it at maybe 15 to 20. But hopefully some of you among the students in the audience tonight might be interested based on this lecture, and hopefully I'll see you in the spring in the class. So there's a pretty elaborate argument, and I'm not sure how far I'll get, and I want to leave time for question and answers. So basically what I've done is I've tried to make it user-friendly in the form of 8 theses. And some of the theses take a little while to explain, but basically it's a kind of step-by-step argument. So the first couple of theses essentially make some arguments about the inheritance, the legacies of urban theory from the 19th and 20th century, and then gradually I shift gears and try to make some forward-looking arguments about, as it were, what needs to be done. So we'll see how far I get, and let me see if I can figure out how to work this. So the first thesis is, after 80 years of existence, the field of urban studies has not succeeded in defining a coherent research object. So we actually don't know what the urban is, and part of the evolution of the field of urban studies is precisely to try to nail down what exactly is the urban. So there's a great quote from one of my favorite urban theorists that I think encapsulates this, not Lefebvre, but actually a former student of Lefebvre, Manuel Castells, who, writing in 1976, wrote the following, and he's commenting on the Chicago School above all with some polemic. He says that after 50 years' existence, only one subject for research in urban sociology remains untackled, namely its subject matter. So there's all this massive empirical research in urban sociology, but the thing that people are ignoring, basically because what they're doing is they're studying processes within cities, presupposing the city is like a spatial container, but the city itself, as a theoretical problem, remains fundamentally uninterrogated. So the question I would pose is this still the case today? And I put social science, but I actually mean urban studies more generally, so certainly including our school. Yes, won't surprise you. I think yes, that is the case. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is the same problem that Castells was talking about in 1976, which is a tendency towards empiricism. So much of what passes for urban research today is basically urban simply by virtue of the fact that whatever is being studied happens to be located in an entity that we happen to call a city. It's simply convention. So I do a lot of review work for different urban studies journals. And I would say maybe 3/4 of the articles that I review are urban simply in this descriptive empirical sense. I mean, it's not that it's wrong to call them urban, but just that the urban remains uninterrogated. It's urban because it's a study of something that happened in Tokyo or London or San Francisco or Boston or wherever. Another reason why the nature of the urban remains unclear is actually more positive from my point of view, and that is that during basically the last 20 or 30 years, there's really been an effervescence of theoretical engagement in the field of urban studies, but there's just disagreement. People really fundamentally disagree about what the nature of the urban is. So there's a lot of theoretical creativity, conceptual innovation in this field, particularly, and this may just be my bias, but particularly in more radical traditions, kind of post-1970s radical and Marxian and feminist-inspired interventions have tried to really engage with some of these theoretical questions. So that's the current situation. Second thesis. So there are a lot of different attempts to nail down the urban, but I want to make a generalization about these attempts, and I'll just read it. The major attempts to define the object of urban studies have been grounded upon what I would call a Worthian legacy, as in Lewis Worth, and I'll explain. Namely, an understanding of the urban as a distinctive settlement type, which is contrasted to other settlement types purportedly outside the urban realm. So the urban and the non-urban as a kind of basic epistemology of this field of study. So why am I associating this with Lewis Worth? It's obviously not Lewis Worth's invention, but in the 1930s, he wrote a famous essay, Urbanism as a Way of Life, which hopefully many people are familiar with, where he really nailed down what I think is the essence of this epistemology. So here's a quote in which he lays this out, and I'll just read it out. How many people, out of curiosity, have read Lewis Worth, Urbanism as a Way of Life? Just out of curiosity. Interesting. Okay, well, if any of you are taking my History and Theory of Urban Interventions class next semester, you will have the opportunity to read this very interesting text. It's quite interesting. The city and the country may be regarded as two poles in reference to one or the other of which human settlements tend to arrange themselves. In viewing urban, industrial, and rural folk society as ideal types of communities, we obtain a perspective for the analysis of basic models of human association that appear in contemporary civilization. So basically, there are a few things going on here. And the core of it, from my point of view, is kind of a fetish of settlement types. The vision of the world as composed of distinctive types of settlement, the urban being one such type which is replicated generically, regardless of contextual specific features of that settlement type, across the entire, ultimately global landscape. So the key kind of anchor for this is the city or the urban. And there's usually a kind of triad, a threefold triad. The city is different from the suburb or the suburban, and most importantly, the rural or the country. So the urban-rural split obviously has a very long distinction in the history of the world, but in urban studies, it's become essentially the implicit and almost universally generalized typology for so much of research. So now obviously in the history of urban studies, particularly in the post-World War II period, our kind of lexicon, our spatial lexicon is much more complex. So there are many other terms that are introduced: town, village, metropolis, metro region, metropolitan region, megalopolis, 100-mile city, primate cities, megacities, edge cities, technoburbs, Zwischenstadt, in-between city, global cities, global city regions, ordinary cities, etc. And you can add to your list. There's a nice article by Peter Taylor a couple of years ago called The Shock of the New, where he lists like 100 new terms that have been used to describe the urban. But I would argue that even with this proliferation of terms for describing settlement space, it doesn't get out of this basic epistemology, this Worthian epistemology, of thinking about the world as being composed of distinct types of settlement. So there are a few things going on here. First of all, I would argue it's methodologically territorialist. So it basically presupposes a world where every quadrant, every point of space is a type of settlement. You may call it this, you may call it that, but the world is composed of types of settlement that are neatly, more or less neatly bounded and separated from one another. And it's a kind of, this is a phrase used out of context from one of my favorite state theorists, Nikos Poulantzas. He referred once to taxonomic fury. It's sort of a furious classification of the whole world. A vision of the world, which again I think is presupposed within so much of urban studies, in which every point in every quadrant of space can and must be analytically frozen in time. It's very static, it's very reifying, and classified as a distinctive type of space. But most importantly of all, for the argument that I want to make, this whole framework presupposes the non-city. And this is probably one of the rare moments in my life when I will quote Derrida. It's a little, not quote, but refer to a concept from Derrida. It's a little bit of a risky move for someone like myself who certainly can't claim any expertise on this. But nonetheless, this concept of the constitutive outside. So we might be talking about the city, but doing so always presupposes a kind of implicit and sometimes explicit reference to the outside, which is constitutive for the very notion of the city, because you can't delineate the city at all as a coherent entity without presupposing that there's some non-city out there in the world. So essentially the argument is this: the coherence and indeed the very intelligibility of the notion of the city, of the very concept of cityness, it's stabilized through a gestural reference to a purportedly non-city realm located beyond or outside urbanized zones. It's rarely specified, and it's generally conceived in ahistorical terms. And I think here of the work of Eric Wolf, who did a lot of interesting analysis of the way that the third world, or what we now call the global south, is represented in Western social science as kind of an ahistorical and static realm. In a way, the non-city, the urban, the countryside, is represented in a similar kind of way. And this brings me to the next thesis, which is the point about ideology. A little bit polemical, but I'll try to develop this. Today, the concept of the city, and indeed that of the rural, the constitutive outside of the city, is pure ideology. The time is ripe, I would argue, to supersede the Worthian legacy and its associated naturalization of settlement types. The proper object of urban studies, I want to argue, and try to develop this argument, is not settlement types as such, but what we might think of as the churning, the creative destruction of settlement types and patterns. That is to say, the process of capitalist urbanization on a world scale. Now, I'll come back to this point about ideology in a little while, because calling it ideology doesn't mean that we can ignore it. But there's a question of whether ideological concepts should become categories of analysis. In other words, they're categories of the city and the rural remain categories of practice, and I'll come back to that. We have to deal with that. But I'm arguing here that we shouldn't use them as categories of analysis. So what does this mean? All this process, churning, creative destruction. So it's a processual conception of space, and I'm not just kind of making this up myself. Of course, I'm building on the work of people like Lefebvre, David Harvey, Doreen Massey, Neil Smith, and others who have been for many years and decades developing this kind of concept, and I'm building on this very explicitly here. So the field of urban studies, from my point of view, needs to focus on the processes themselves, the contradictory creative destruction of social space at all sites and scales. So a few concretizations of this: the churning of settlement types, processes of agglomeration, that is to say centralization, and decentralization. Lefebvre refers to this as implosion, explosion. Strategies of the state, spatial strategies of the state, to manage patterns of urbanization, which as I've tried to argue in some of my other work, are constantly evolving and transforming in relationship to both forces of capital accumulation as well as social and political struggles. The flow and embedding of capital, infrastructure, and populations across and among spaces and territories, and social and political struggles over the form and the organization of space at all scales. Don't get me wrong. Clearly, the field of urban studies, as we inherit it from the 19th century, is focusing on all of these processes. but it's a question of what are the implications of that focus for our conceptual apparatus, and that's what I'm interested in. So this, to me, poses not the urban question, which is, of course, the title of Castells' famous book from the early 1970s, The Urban Question, but rather the urbanization question. It's the question of the urban, what David Harvey called the urban process. So the urban question, for me, is embedded within and even superseded by the urbanization question. The production and churning or creative destruction of sociospatial forms. So that it's one thing on an abstract level to declare everything is process, everything is dialectical. You could say, okay, I'll sign on to that. To actually follow through on that in practice and still have a coherent conceptual apparatus, tricky. And perhaps we can discuss that. You'll see how far I go in pulling that off. So, but the claim is, at this point, we need to think urbanization. Not the city and not just the urban. So we may want to call it the urbanization theory lab, but that's kind of a little awkward. But that's the direction that I'm going, the urbanization question. So, but here's the problem, or here's another problem that now presents itself. So we actually have theories of urbanization. We have a lot of discourse about urbanization in the social sciences, in planning, and so forth. But as it turns out, if you look at the main theories of urbanization that we have, or if you track the ways in which the concept of urbanization is used, I want to argue it doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it replicates, it reproduces the problem. And this is because, and this is my fourth thesis, the notions of urbanization that prevail in popular discussion and in social science basically rest upon an almost purely demographic conception of urbanization, which essentially presupposes the notion of the city as a settlement type, and the claim is simply that urbanization is the growth of the population of cities. Very simple definition. It's not incoherent. On its own terms, it's perfectly plausible, but it doesn't address the problem that I've tried to delineate in the previous remarks. So it focuses, indeed, on very large-scale transformations, but it essentially reproduces this Worthian legacy or fetish because the whole thing can only be stabilized if you have a notion of the city with coherent juridical boundaries inside of which the population is growing. Without that, the whole thing, the whole concept just dissolves. So if you do a Google image search, which is not necessarily a scientific method, but it's at least a starting point for thinking about what's out there in the cosmos, you will find, if you do a Google image search on urbanization, you will find hundreds of pictures like this. I just chose this like among many, many that you can find. And basically, you get some version of an argument that the global, in quotation marks, urban population is expanding. And again and again in conference proposals, in the beginning of articles, the beginning of dissertation proposals, beware, the beginning of grant proposals, you will see some version of the following statement. As of something like the following, and I'm sure those of you who read urban research will recognize this. Some version of the following, and some of you probably already can predict what I'm about to say. As of year X, 1995, 2005, more than 50% of the world's population is urban. We now live in an urban world. Hundreds, thousands. I would like to hire someone, if anyone is interested in doing this, and actually let's try to track the uses of this statement. It's repeated again and again, and like we say, okay, we know the world is urban. But what does this mean? What does this actually mean? And you can find diagrams like this. Yes, there are major global population movements going on, and we need to take them very seriously. We need to analyze them. I'm not trying to dismiss the importance of demographic transformations, fundamental. But claiming that they represent simply urbanization is almost meaningless. It's not completely meaningless, but I would go pretty far down the road of saying it's almost meaningless. For a simple reason. Where do you draw the boundaries of the city? If you draw them, the metropolitan region, the Gottmanian megalopolis, if you use the juridical boundaries of country A, the juridical boundaries in country B are different. So depending on where you bound it, which is of course the fundamental question of this whole discourse, how do you bound? And the whole Worthian move implies bounding. Depending on where you bound it, you're going to decide that this urban transition occurred earlier or later. Or if you bound it smaller, you might argue that this urban transition hasn't happened at all. And the whole argument essentially black boxes what is happening demographically outside of the so-called city that is generating this urban transition. So, and where I'm going with this is that we need a theory of urbanization that contains what was previously viewed as the outside. It contains it, it internalizes it, as part of the urbanization process itself. And I would make that argument even with reference to the 19th century, when Engels is writing about the proletarianization of Manchester. That's basically an argument about accumulation by dispossession in the countryside. And you need both moments in order to develop a theory of urbanization. That is not outside in this framework. At that moment, it may have looked like it's outside, but today, given where we stand, that is not outside. That is internal to the problem. So, even Mike Davis, who is someone who I really learn a lot from, but no less a figure than Mike Davis, makes this move. How many people have read Planet of Slums? Okay, so more people have read Mike Davis than Lewis Worth. We've established that. The exact event is unimportant and it will pass entirely unnoticed. Nonetheless, it will constitute a watershed in human history. This is page 1 of Planet of Slums. For the first time, the urban population of the world will outnumber the rural. Cities have absorbed nearly 2/3 of the global population explosion since 1950 and are currently growing by 1 million babies and migrants each week. The global countryside, meanwhile, has reached its maximum population and will begin to shrink after 2020. As a result, cities will account for virtually all future world population growth. Again, there's something going on here. There is a spatial transformation going on, and we need to map it. But this way of representing it, even by a very critical and very widely read and highly reflexive urban theorist like Mike Davis, this does not do the trick. So urbanization, from my point of view, is a key problematic of 21st century capitalism. I'm going to just skip over this because it's basically what I've already said. I don't have to read it again. So we need alternative theoretical resources. So I'm going to, I've been going for like 25 minutes, and I kind of want to get to the end of this. So the next section of this, thesis 5, and Christophe, I'm glad you're still here, because this is for you, this is Lefebvre. But the thing is, I'm going to have to really blast through this. But essentially, the move is this. We need to excavate 20th century urban theory for alternative cartographies and conceptual frameworks to think urbanization in ways that confront the problem that I've tried to outline. Lefebvre does not have all the answers. I think Lefebvre has some pretty important questions, one of which was, he called it la révolution urbaine, the urban revolution, in my terms, the urbanization question. But there are I want to really emphasize so that people don't think I'm just Lefebvre, even though I do think you can go a long way with Lefebvre. There are many other theorists who, from the point of view of this problematique, one can reread. And suddenly they become very forward-thinking, very forward-looking. So you can reappropriate maybe Christaller, maybe. He's certainly multiscalar, although he's also place-centric. You can reappropriate Jean Gottman, who already in the early 60s was completely exploding the framework of urban studies. Really quite radical. And Nicholas, I don't know if you're here, but I've recently been kind of reintroduced to Doxiadis. And Doxiadis, I mean, again, in some ways he's absolute, and he's connected to Harvard in all kinds of ways. He's tied to the moment in which he was writing Fordist Keynesian capitalism, global decolonization, developmentalism, etc. But the scale, I mean, this is something that Nicholas has been developing in some of his writings, the scale is absolutely global. Buckminster Fuller. So there are people who you can reappropriate from the point of view of this planetary problematique. Lefebvre is one. So essentially, in this part of the presentation, I basically flag a couple of key concepts that I think are relevant for this. And I've got some long quotations, and I'm just going to kind of skip it because, hopefully someday we'll do a seminar just on Lefebvre. People that are interested in this, we can really dig into this. But I think for the moment, that's too much detail. But I will just list the concepts. The point here is just that Lefebvre's work has been really influential in critical urban studies, but particularly by Marxists, he's mainly been paradoxically interpreted as a theorist of the city. So when David Harvey appropriated Lefebvre in Social Justice in the City, 1976, it's basically Lefebvre as a theorist of the city, above all, and so many others who are trying to think about the urban. And that's part of Lefebvre. But the urbanization moment of Lefebvre, the Lefebvre of La Révolution Urbaine has been neglected until recently, and that's in part because the book has finally been translated into English. So for Anglo-American scholars, it's now becoming an important reference point. So I'm not going to go through these quotations, but just to give you kind of a taste, the notion of the urban fabric, it's like a tissue, it's woven across the whole landscape unevenly, very fundamental. The notion of implosion, explosion, which I already alluded to. So it's both concentration and it's almost like a star that's about to explode. Forces pulling social and economic and political life inwards and then exploding outwards. The notion of the worldwide, mondialisation, kind of hard for me to say, but it's not the same as globalization. It's worldization, and the concept of world is a technical concept in Lefebvre, le monde. So that needs further fleshing out. But the idea is not just that the world is filled up by urbanization. The world is actually produced as a site, as a horizon, through this process of planetary urbanization. And then the notion of complete or generalized urbanization. So, all right. So I have 3 more theses, and I'm going to try to, maybe another 10 minutes. I don't know, are people, I've got momentum, so I want to keep, I'm going to try to get through the last couple theses just to give you a sense of where this is all going. So one of my earlier theses was that the city is pure ideology and the rural is pure ideology. So now I come back to that, and what does it mean to say that it's ideology? And I have the camera obscura, which is, of course, a reference to Marx and Engels in the German ideology. They say that ideology is a camera obscura, and it represents the world upside down. And what I take from that is ideologies are not simply false consciousness. They're structured by everyday practice. So ideology is a form of practice, and it's embedded within social practices. We have to deal with them. They are a part of reality. So the problem that emerges here, which I think the Urban Theory Lab and anyone trying to deal with this problematic have to deal with, is that we continue to talk about the cartography of the world using city, suburb, rural, countryside. In academic life we do that, hopefully less so, but certainly in journalism and in everyday life, these are very plausible concepts for thinking about the world that we live in. So for me, this is a question. In other words, rather than just presupposing that that actually represents the world, the problem is to view these representations as an effect, an urban effect. And the question then becomes, how do these urban effects get produced? So it's the production of a fetish. The fetishized model of settlement space continues to be promoted within social science, within political discourse, planning practice, and everyday life. The vision of a world composed of neatly bounded settlement types. So a key problematic for a critical theory of generalized or complete urbanization is to analyze the production of this urban effect across different contexts and across history, across modern history. So in a way, I don't know how many people have read Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities on Nationalism. And part of what I'm saying here is basically that urban studies today is the way nationalism studies was before Benedict Anderson wrote that book in 1983. So in other words, prior to Anderson's intervention, nations were just simply viewed as real objects, even by social scientists, and the idea was to typologize them and kind of analyze differences and similarities among different nations. And part of what, not just Anderson, but people who wrote in the wake of Anderson about nationalism, part of what that did is to say, well, yes, the notion of the nation as a political and social identity is real, but it's produced. It's produced through circulation, the circulation of particular types of texts and representations under modern capitalism, and certain technologies that facilitate the construction of a temporal frame that links people together who aren't proximate, such that they can view themselves as members of the same national community. And essentially, I want to pose, or I want to suggest that we ought to pose the same question about the city. In other words, the city is not just simply a pre-given thing. To the degree that we think we live in a city, like take Boston, what produces our notion, or Cambridge, or Somerville, or wherever you might live, what produces your assumption, if you have it, that you live in something that's called Boston? And I want to argue that's an effect. And studying what it's the effect of is complex, but I think that's the move we have to make. So instead of just assuming Boston is a coherent entity that you then study. The question is, what produces that coherence that enables you to think of it either as a category of analysis or as a category of practice as a coherent entity? So how are such urban effects produced during the historical geography of capitalism and modern state formation? And a PhD student of mine at NYU, David Wachsmuth, has just written a terrific paper called The Urban Ideology, which basically tries to pursue this problematique. And I listed some ideas that I have about what produces the effect. So the state would be an obvious, drawing territorial borders, jurisdictional border. That produces the effect. And it's a real effect. State knowledges, the way that statistics are gathered, the census would be, again, an obvious example. Political strategies, so the degree that Boston is competing with, I don't know, Providence or New York City or wherever to attract investment. That creates Bostonness, as it were. So logics of interspatial competition. And one should add to this architecture, transformations of the built environment and design. So it's interesting to ask, in what ways do architecture and urban design produce an urban effect, and in what ways might they countervail or counterbalance against the urban effect? I think that's an interesting question to discuss. But the claim I'm making here under this urban effect rubric is that critical urban studies, or urban studies more generally, hasn't even begun to denaturalize, much less to analyze the production of this urban effect. The city is just taken for granted, and that's why I call it a fetish. So, okay, I'm kind of winding down. There are a lot of issues that follow from this, a lot of agendas that follow from this. And I just want to introduce one distinction which I'm going to be developing in my own work, and I'm doing some collaboration with Christian Schmidt, who is at the ETH in Zurich, and we're trying to develop this. But we want to argue, so this is now we, not the royal we, but we, Christian and myself, we want to develop this particular conception of the urbanization question, which entails two different moments, a moment of implosion or concentration and a moment of extension or explosion. So kind of dialectical framework that we're trying to develop. So concentrated urbanization is what urban studies has always focused on. It's the moment of centralization, agglomeration, implosion. And I should really just pause for a moment and underscore this. At the beginning of this presentation, when I said urban studies should no longer be the study of cities, this is not a kind of Melvin Weber post-city world argument. Because within this framework that I'm now sort of elaborating, the city, or at least the agglomeration, is indeed a moment that remains fundamental. So the force of agglomeration, of centralization, is a powerful spatial dynamic within modernity. But it's one moment within a multifaceted process. The other moment we want to argue, and this is really kind of the anchor for our theorization of urbanization, building on Lefebvre, we call it extended urbanization. And here's a preliminary definition. The earlier versions were even longer than this, so it's a bit of a mouthful, but this is intended to be a technical definition. The uneven transformation of territory, place, and scale to facilitate the continued growth, thickening, and reorganization of the urban fabric. So the idea is that there's an urban fabric that's woven across the territory that's relatively dense, relatively concentrated. But that presupposes transformations at other sites and spaces to facilitate that continual weaving together. So different representation of the same thing. Concentrated urbanization, again, that's what we all sort of know from like intro to urban planning, urban studies, whatever. And the morphology that's basically been fetishized within the field is this moment of centralization, concentrated. It's the big city. Introducing extended urbanization, again, it's the same definition as before, but what it means is that the morphology, the spatiality of the thing is completely open to analysis. You don't presuppose that it looks any particular way or another particular way. You've got to look at it. But that, again, is part of urbanization for us. It's not the outside, it's a key moment of the whole thing. So instead of just fetishizing concentrated urbanization, we want to look at extended urbanization. And you can start, this is just sketches at this point, but this is where we're going. You can start to periodize. So the reference to Engels that I made before and Manchester, I was already basically suggesting that it wasn't just concentration and centralization within Manchester. There's a massive dispossession of rural populations in the countryside. In these terms, extended urbanization. So they're both going on. But what Christian and I are trying to develop, and it's still a little sketchy, but what we're trying to suggest is that there's always a dialectical interconnection between these two moments of urbanization, but that itself is historically specific. So arguably during much of the history of capitalism up to this date, concentrated urbanization has really been like the leading edge of urbanization. And again, fleshing that out is a tricky proposition. But what we're going to try to suggest is that sometime in the last 30, 40 years, and again, this is rough, there's something like a critical point, and again, that's a term from Lefebvre, in which puts extended urbanization, this broader morphological transformation of the world to facilitate the thickening and extension of the urban fabric, which puts that into the foreground. So urban theory, if it's referred to extended urbanization at all, it's as an outside with concentrated urbanization in the foreground, and we're kind of saying that after this critical point, you turn the thing on its head, and suddenly, so you still have concentrated urbanization as part of the story, but extended urbanization is the broader encompassing category. That's the direction that we're going. Last thesis. And this is really just, this thesis is basically, I invite you to join me in this quest to think about these problems in many different contexts if you feel convinced by this line of analysis. And even if you don't, please join us so that we can strengthen our arguments. So the claim is that systematic pursuit of the urbanization question may explode, supersede, and maybe reinvigorate the field of urban studies. So I'll be very brief here, but basically the claim is that, yes, we still need to study centralized, large-scale urban regions, megalopolises, their built environments. So centralization remains important. And I'm just putting too much text here to say what I just said, so I'm going to skip that. But in the red is kind of the but, which is that this is only one moment within the creative destruction of capitalist space. There are many other moments. And here's, just to get the ball rolling, here's some ideas. So the urbanization of the oceans. If anybody wants to study the oceans as a design and planning problem, let's talk. To me, the oceans are a key terrain of extended urbanization. And this is just a map of shipping lanes. But this is not outside of the big cities. You cannot have the big cities without this terrain of interaction, exchange, pollution, just, etc. So pollution is a design problem. It's a planning problem. Not just of the oceans, but of the atmosphere. Highway networks, urban corridors, infrastructure. So these highway corridors gird the globe. To the degree that we have automobility, anyway, they gird the globe. They gird the globe. And they are the infrastructure of urbanization, not just the cities. The deserts. So basically, the idea here is that sites that normally we don't think of as urban or related to urbanization suddenly become internalized within the work that we have to do, including at a place like the GSD. So mountain zones, alpine tourism. Some of you may be familiar with Christian Schmidt's book that he co-authored with several very important architects, including Herzog and de Meuron, who I believe are connected to us. Switzerland, an urban portrait. And this basically argues that all of Switzerland, has anybody read it, just out of curiosity? Do people? A few of you have. It's an amazing book. We're going to read it in the seminar next semester. Basically, he argues essentially what I'm arguing: the whole world is urban, or all of Switzerland is urban. Now we're extending it to the world. So he goes around Switzerland, Christian and his colleagues, and presents this argument in the mountain village where there are cows, grazing outside the window, and someone in the audience raises their hand and says, "But look at the cows. These are cows." And his response is, "Well, they're urban cows. They're urban cows. So you have to revise your concept of the cow." That's a longer conversation. But the atmosphere, seriously, for me, the atmosphere, global warming, environmental destruction of the planet, that is an urbanization problem. So in the GSD, we need to think of the atmosphere as a design problem. We need to redesign the way our built environments, and I know several of you, maybe many of you are thinking about this. We need to redesign the way that our built environments affect not just the atmosphere immediately around, quote unquote, the cities, but the entire globe. Global warming for me is the consequence of global capitalist industrial urbanization. It's not contained within the boundaries of the city. The rainforest deforestation of the Amazon. Again, there's a brilliant PhD thesis by a Brazilian geographer, Montemor, I can't remember his first name, Montemor, who basically did an urbanization-focused study of the Amazon. He's not the only one who has done that, but he basically used a Lefebvrean approach to think about the urbanization of the Amazon. And in this framework, deforestation is absolutely connected not just to global urbanization, but also to the immediate urbanization processes that are going on within the Amazon. So there are many other directions that one can take this, but this is just an attempt to give you a sense of the types of empirical, concrete projects that might flow from the kinds of theoretical arguments that I've been trying to make. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm sure there's lots of provocative statements. I've learned a few things, that whenever you invite a planning professor at the GSD, they always come with a parent or two, which is a really wonderful thing, since we had Gerald and his mother, and now we have your parents. Second, they obviously promote their courses very well, which you did. And thirdly, they're very visual, which is also wonderful. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Let me just begin by asking you this question. I very much agree with the argument about urbanization, but I'm wondering whether you don't feel that by trying to emphasize the point about the processes of urbanization, that in some ways, despite your sort of reassurance at the end that you're still interested in the artifact, in some way that the artifact gets a little bit left out of the picture. Mm-hmm. And I just want to refer to the moment somewhere in the middle of the presentation when you're referring to the concept of settlement types.
Yep.
And just in the field of architecture and urban design, when people also sometimes refer to the type or the settlement type, they really see within the type as something which is not constant, that is always going through a process of transformation. And therefore, the type is always evolving. It's not stable. It's not constant. So this suggests that in certain instances, when people refer to the urban, they're referring to the artifact, the object of the city, but also its processes of urbanization within itself. I think this becomes quite clear when you try to use the word urbanization and make of it as something which is equivalent to the urban, and the word doesn't work. In a way, like the word urbanization doesn't have the capacity to stand for the urban, which could be both a thing and a process. And I'm just wondering, how do you feel about the linguistic difficulties of using something which emphasizes so much process and doesn't have the kind of capacity to hold on to the object and hold on to the artifact, and especially in the context of a school that is trying to design cities and architecture and buildings and things like this. You are leaving us behind in your analysis of this particular process.
No, thank you, Moisen. So a couple thoughts about this. One is that that in general, I think the tendency, certainly within the social sciences, and arguably also within the planning and design disciplines, is to bend the stick, as it were, towards reification, towards the sort of the static representation. So there's no solution, but at minimum, like if there's a takeaway from this, if you're trying to build something or design something and you're wondering how can I apply this, I would just say, well, just try to bend it back a little bit in the other direction, or quite a bit, and see what happens. See what happens to the way that you think, not just about the space, but about your relationship to the space. You know, if you think about a building as a process, which maybe many of you already do, But like, what if you really try to follow through on that? What if, or you build a highway or a bike lane or a neighborhood, and you really think it, and you integrate the notion that it's a process that's going to be transformed not just through what you do or through what you envision, but through the users, through unintended consequences, through crises, through natural disasters, through who knows what. Who knows what? It depends on your time scale for how you think about whatever you're building. What does that mean? I mean, that's a practical design, planning, architectural question. And again, I know that I'm not the first person by any means to sort of put that on the table. But in terms of a practical takeaway from this for the actual disciplines of building, constructing, planning, like that's really what it is. In other words, there's no way, and this is almost an existential problem. It's not just a kind of dialectical theory problem. There's almost no way to fully avoid reification. When I say the word I, I'm reifying myself, it seems to me. Because what am I? I'm process, I'm change, etc. So, there's no solution to that. And the same thing applies to the building. But it's like, what happens if I think about my identity as process? I mean, that was, many philosophers try to do that, and then it becomes quite tricky, whether you're Freud or you're Sartre or whomever. So do the same thing with space, and it complicates things. But the other thing that I would like to say about this is that it's not just an existential problem. It's not just a problem of grammar, of language. Problems of grammar and language, at least the way I think of grammar and language, are problems in the world. So in other words, they're real abstractions of what actually exists in the world. So what I mean concretely is that in the production of the built environment, this very tension obtains. There is a moment of tendential stabilization, let's say within this building. I mean, this building might change, but right now, I can pace, I can walk, we can talk, we can presuppose this container, even though we think that space is not a container. So there is this moment of tendential fixity, and it looks different in different places at different scales and different contexts. But then at the same time, there's this equally endemic moment of process. So the question is how to internalize reflexivity about that contradiction or that opposition within the work we do, whether as social scientists, as analysts of the urban, or for that matter, as practitioners or builders. So it's insoluble, but it's a question of, if you realize that it's an insoluble dialectic, I think your work, whether theoretically or practically, will be more effective than if you're not aware of that dialectic, if you just choose one side. So I wonder, maybe the way to proceed is, I know we don't have all that much time, but just to get different voices in this conversation, if maybe we collect a couple of questions, and I'll just make notes and then try to respond to some of them, because I'm really just also curious for reactions. And I don't know, most of you, I might recognize many of your faces, but most of you I don't know, so maybe just, if you would, introduce yourself, and is that okay? We do it?
Sure.
Yep.
There's a question there. Maybe there's a question
Ryan.
in the back.
Hi, I'm Ryan Sentner, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Tufts. And I have two specific, somewhat related questions. The first one is, in your reading, your view, what did Castells get wrong so that we no longer talk very much about the urban question, and so that he himself entirely abandoned that research agenda some 20 years ago? And then what, in your interpretation, would be Lefebvre's beef with studies of place? Not Doreen Massey's Lefebvrean critique of place, but what would be Lefebvre's problem with place as an object of study?
Yep.
There's another question.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a MLA here. My question is related to how much of your argument hinges on a particular definition of capitalism, insofar as you've levied this critique against the urban, but I think that there are arguments that levy a similar critique against sort of capitalism as an object, as a sort of fetishized historiographical ideological term, right? So you can look at something like the Enclosures Acts or the various iterations thereof, or Brodel's studies of the Mediterranean to sort of dislocate a very particular location of capitalism in, the Marx-Engels spectrum. So I'm just wondering sort of how that works in and how that sort of recontextualizes where you're sort of drawing that diagram or how you're drawing that diagram of the, well, it's not up there anymore, but of the concentrated and extended. Yeah.
I am Jeannie Sook. I'm a professor of law at Harvard Law School. And I wanted to ask about, looking at all of these images of networks of interaction, interchange, of communication. I really wondered if there shouldn't be a slide showing like the internet, because it's become, I think, a really important new strategy of governance, right? That urbanization is happening through governance using the internet, and social networking and communications and digital strategies have become a very important part of the agenda of governance. And so how does that connect with your critique and the relationship between concentration and extension?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else? I think you should answer this. I got my work cut out for me. Yeah. How much time you guys have here? No, these are great questions. So I'm going to have to be a little telegraphic in the sense that, answering any of these, we could do another, long lecture. But I'll just give you a sense of where I would go. I mean, all the questions are like really right on point. I mean, so Ryan, what did Castells get wrong? I mean, long story, but for those of you who have read his book, The Urban Question, he defines the urban with reference to the function of the reproduction of labor power. So as he calls it in those kind of 1970s terms, collective consumption. So in a funny kind of way, it's a very functionalist, or at least functional definition. It's not spatial at all. I mean, the urban question is filled with interesting reflections about urbanization, including in these extended urbanization terms. But at the end of the day, in his sort of Althusserian moment, it's basically a function. And the claim is just that the specificity of that function is what defines the urban. So if social reproduction suddenly became global, which for the moment it's arguably not, then it would also be urban. But I think the problem is basically that, we all know, it seems to me, that multiple functions crystallize and materialize within, I'll say, agglomerations instead of cities. So it breaks, and Castells knows this, but ultimately it breaks down. In terms of Lefebvre and place, again, very interesting question. I recently wrote a paper with Stuart Eldon where we systematically tried to excavate Lefebvre's concept of territory. And it was a very difficult exercise because at first blush, it's not clear that Lefebvre has a concept of territory. He uses the word, but that doesn't mean he has a concept. And we actually found out that he does, and that it's useful. So the challenge would be, Lefebvre he uses the word place. And I would guess, I don't know if I would bet, but I might, that Lefebvre also has a concept of place. In other words, he doesn't just use the word. He uses different words, actually. In the same way, the question of, does Lefebvre has a concept of scale? People have criticized me for reading a scale theory into Lefebvre. But I actually think he doesn't just use the word échelle or niveau. He has a concept. So the question would be, what is that concept? But I don't read Lefebvre as an anti-place theorist. It's about, as Andy Merrifield would say, a place-space dialectic. So one would have to go in that direction. Alex's question, where are you, Alex? Thank you. The concept of capitalism, enclosures, and how that articulates to extended versus concentrated urbanization. Very, very much on point. And I have to think more about this. I have a certain concept of capitalism that I'm presupposing. And so part of your question is, I think, just underscoring, well, wait, there might be other, at least this is how I hear you, there might be other concepts of capitalism that are out there which might differentially articulate to this particular distinction. But and I think that's a reasonable reaction. But what I would argue is that the distinction between extended and concentrated urbanization certainly hinges on the use of the term capitalism. In other words, the claim that the capitalist character of socioeconomic life, the accumulation of capital in pursuit of profit, the reinvestment of the surplus in pursuit of profit, the ways in which that particular process mediates the extraction of labor, the production of space, and the circulation of goods. I mean, for starters. In other words, a conception of capitalism on that level of generality is necessary to make that distinction in the way that we're making it. However, the distinction itself is arguably compatible with a number of different conceptions. So like Polanyi has a concept of capitalism, not particularly Marxian, and I think that you could embed that into a Polanyian concept. Within whatever we call Marxian approaches to sociospatial theory, we could probably come up with 20 different concepts of capitalism, including associated with the names that have been under discussion here. And I think it's broadly compatible with them, but I've got to dig a little deeper into figuring out what the implications are, particularly of the use of the notion of extended urbanization, in order to figure out that question of compatibility. So I think it's a useful question, and I've basically got to dig deeper to figure it out. But for the moment, the point where I would dig in my heels is to say that, well, the distinction presupposes the notion of capitalism as a useful concept for understanding the historical geographical specificity of the world that we live in. So that may not satisfy you, but give me a few more months. And so Jeannie's question about networks, 100% take the point. So it actually is problematic that I haven't used the term networks at all in this presentation, and I think that's a problem. I've used the word place, I've used the word space, I've used the word territory, and I've used the word scale. And actually, in the framework that I use to think about sociospatial theory and that I've developed in some work that I've done, we make a distinction between, in one paper we call it TPSN. It's a little kind of crude, but T, territory, P, place, S, scale, and networks. And the claim that we try to make in thinking about the production of space and therefore also the production of urbanization is that many approaches to sociospatial theory privilege or even fetishize one of those dimensions of space. So there are many approaches to sociospatial theory, this goes back to Ryan's question, that fetishize place. Place is the main category. There are others that fetishize territory, including mainstream social sciences that just presuppose everything is territorial. And I've been involved in a discussion of scale for the better part of a decade. And the interesting thing about that discussion is that it essentially vacillated from one pole where scale became everything. So I call that contingent essentially scale-centric analyses, where scale just becomes a synonym for space. And then some of the same authors who were engaging in this kind of scale-centrism somersaulted, and now they've abolished scale. And they talk about flat ontologies, sometimes using or misusing Latour. So the category network is a key part of this debate for the same reasons. So, and again, Castells, back to Castells, as people will know, he made some very famous arguments and continues to make some very famous arguments that privilege networks as the fundamental category of space for thinking about, the network society, as he calls it. So place is being annihilated, scale doesn't really figure into the picture, and territory is being deterritorialized or hollowed out. So everything becomes network. And basically what I try to do, both with collaborators and in my own thinking about this, is use each of those categories as a rubric for thinking about dimensions, historically specific dimensions and combinations. So network is part of the story that I want to tell, even though, indeed, I didn't tell it here. But these shipping lanes are transportation networks. So adding a global map of internet use and the transoceanic, transcontinental infrastructures, pipes, wires, circuitry that facilitate something like the internet is, for me, absolutely a dimension of both concentrated and extended urbanization. So both that point I take on board, that the internet is a dimension. It's also, by the way, a dimension of agglomeration, because the production of something like the internet presupposes massive agglomerations of capital. You can't, even though it looks like it's just flow, you can't have the flow at all. It can't exist without nodal points. So in a way, the internet would be a perfect, like the question would be, what would it look like in the urban theory lab, as it were, to study the internet, the global internet network, using this kind of framework. You couldn't have a conception of the network simply as a space of deterritorialization. It would be part of this very woven, tightly woven fabric of uneven development, basically. So, point taken. Should we do another round, or are people out of gas?
We do one more round.
Yeah? Please.
No. We
need a mic.
Thank you very much. I'm Francesca Leder. I am professor of urban planning in Italy at the University of Ferrara, visiting at Harvard at Center for European Studies. I was interested in the first question posed by the Dean, because I was thinking that when I was a student in Venice, Professor Tafuri, who was a professor of history of architecture, used to tell us that history was not useful in the practice of architecture as a tool. And so I was thinking if we have to consider urban studies in relation with urban planning, urban design, or city making in general at the same point, so not useful as a tool. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, Neil, for the really great lecture. The question about urbanization often brings up the question or the process of the urban as a problem, and I think that's been reoccurring as part of urban studies, sociology, even urbanists. This constant reoccurring idea that the urban is a problem, mm-hmm. which has necessarily engendered the idea that designers across a number of different disciplines are constantly trying to solve. Yeah. We often use this idea of problem solving as part of our work. Obviously, your perspective is pointing, I think, in a number of different roles for designers. So how could you infer or take that a little bit further? And also at the same time, the idea of the urban as a problem infers or entails the idea of the biophysical world as recipient of the effects of urbanization, as opposed to the opposite, which is perhaps generative of patterns of urbanization. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, based on what you presented tonight.
Catherine Tang, I'm a second-year urban designer.
Wait, where?
Right here.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
If the urban is a process and not necessarily an object or a container, what's your take on the sometimes static or rigid nature of political boundaries for states, for cities, etc.?
What do you mean, what is my take? Like, tell me more about what
do you believe they're appropriate? Do you believe they're too rigid? Do you believe they're necessary?
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I'm Sai.
Sai, yeah.
I'm doing my PhD on interurban corridors. And I completely agree with you, and I hope I can have longer conversations with you on the fetishization of the rural and the urban, yeah, and how these political geographies of interurban corridors really defy these dichotomies. But when you do look at the urban as produced by and productive of capitalism, and you think about networks and flows, is there anything then which is non-urban?
No. Okay. Simple answer, no. What? Okay, the moon. But actually, no. Actually, no. No. Interplanetary, the next step is interplanetary urbanization. Outer space, I mean, all right, Sai, I didn't want to cut you off, though, because I mean, I'm starting with your question just because you asked a yes or no question, so I could say no. But if you had more to say, you please finish, and then I'll respond.
How can we make this a more productive discourse when everything is urban? So then how can we take this forward?
Okay. All right, since I'm already provoked by Sai, I'll start with you. Great question. So a couple things. Number one, no, there is no outside. It's no longer the constitutive outside. We are inside an urban planet. When Lefebvre was writing in the 1970s, he said planetary urbanization is a virtual object. Today, it's being actualized. There's no outside. So the moon, outer space, what kind of infrastructure does it take to build a rocket ship or a satellite? Where is the infrastructure located? How does it work? If you actually do a studio on NASA, you're going to look at a space of urbanization. So it's not just that I'm not saying, oh, the moon is like a big giant city, although maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's not really my remit, but putting a person on the moon presupposes urbanization. So therefore, it's urban. So that's the direction it goes. But the second part of Sai's question, so then what do you do? Well, the challenge is we need new categories of spatial differentiation. My claim is not that the surface of the moon is the same as Houston Street in New York City or Mass Ave. No. Although, you can read science fiction where they have the urbanization of everything, like R.G. Ballard, J.G. I mean, great speculator about this question. Lots of other science fiction writers, but that's not what we're dealing with here. The problem is that once you declare that it's all urban, you're essentially saying that you need a different way of capturing spatial difference than the urban-rural distinction, or the inside-outside distinction. And I don't know what the answer is. Christian Schmidt did like 3 or 4 studios over a couple of years with his colleagues in Basel to try to confront that question with regard to Switzerland. And they made a map, kind of a land use map, at the end of those books, sort of 4 volumes, Switzerland and Urban Portrait, where they tried to come up with a differentiated map of Switzerland which did not use the word rural. And you can debate, does it work, does it not work? But that's the kind of exercise that would follow from this. So it doesn't solve anything. It simply reformulates the question. But it seems to me that in order to begin to make sense, to generate useful knowledge, to intervene in useful ways, we need different categories. So saying that there's no outside, it's not a Foucauldian kind of, we're all subjected to some gigantic functional power system. It's not that kind of argument. It's basically a way of posing a question. So the question from Catherine about political jurisdictions, really interesting question. And I do not know the answer. But I think, again, thanks, Carolyn. We should pose, that wasn't Carolyn, sorry. There, you're up there. You're wearing the same shirt, or the same color shirt. So the question of boundaries and jurisdictional boundaries, how can we think about political jurisdiction in a different way? And that would be an example. This goes back to Moysen's initial point of the sort of moment of fixity within the built environment. And jurisdictional boundaries, they change over time, but they're very hard to change, particularly within constitutional systems. So I'm drawing a bit of a blank on kind of what kind of pragmatic recommendation follows from that. But that would be an example of how certain fixed models or fixed frameworks of space get reproduced over time. If you establish a boundary, that has a kind of path dependency. And changing that boundary, changing something that's path dependent over time is very complex. So kind of a big bracket around that. Francesca's question about Tafuri and, where are you? There you are, sorry. Should we approach these questions historically? The answer would be absolutely yes, 100%. So it's not simply a modernist move of saying, forget about all that earlier 20th century urban theory, let's start from scratch. Part of the arc of this argument, the first, I think, 4 theses were really about how do we locate ourselves in relationship to Engels, Burgess, Park, Worth, David Harvey, Henri Lefebvre, among many others. So a lot of the teaching that I want to do, like in my classes at the school, is absolutely about how to reread and reappropriate these traditions, which I would argue continue to condition our knowledge of space, often in ways that we don't know, we're not even aware of. So when I first started teaching urban sociology at NYU, like over 12 years ago, I had to assign Lewis Wirth. And as kind of a young, kind of Marxian-inspired urbanist, I just wanted to do battle with Lewis Wirth. This is the Castell's critique of Lewis Wirth from The Urban Question. It's pure ideology, it's misrepresenting power and class struggle, et cetera, et cetera. And you can make that argument. But from my point of view, now, like a little older, maybe a little mellower, like I don't think you can make that argument, and the first time you teach Lewis Wirth to undergraduates, I think that's an important argument to sort of put on the table. But I don't think it's that interesting. The more interesting question from the point of view of what I'm doing is what kind of model of global spatial organization does Lewis Wirth presuppose? So in other words, precisely by reappropriating that history from the point of view of what we might now think of as extended urbanization, we can think about extended urbanization in a different way. Because again, I would argue you can find analyses of extended urbanization, of this constitutive outside, in Engels, in the Chicago School, and in the sort of radical urban theory of the 1970s. It's just not theorized as such. So we have to do that. And last but not least, Pierre, I saved your question for last because I think it's actually a good way to conclude this. So the question was the construction of the urban as a problem and how we might think about that using this particular framework. And I guess there are kind of two consequences, at least, of this. And these are a little bit polemical, but see what you think. I mean, one is that what we often call an urban problem is not an urban problem. And to the degree that we think about it as an urban problem, that's a fetish, that's a misrecognition. So, and the US urban policy would just be, take education, take economic development, take environmental degradation, take transportation, take almost anything. And it might be constructed as an urban problem. But using a framework like this, you can almost always see that, homelessness, you can almost always see that what appears to be urban is actually produced elsewhere. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have a local expression. It does. And those expressions matter. But the sources are not urban. So we have, as Logan and Malish have argued, we have urban growth machines in the United States. So local governments compete for, and others compete for investment. But they're only urban. The only reason they're urban is because we have an intergovernmental system that localizes various types of functions, including a significant portion of revenue collection. So to the degree that localities are having to provide public services based on locally collected taxes, they're going to compete for more high value added forms of land use that generate more revenues. So that's a localization of an urban problem, or that's a localization of a problem that then becomes urban. So that would be one, that anytime something is presented to us as an urban problem, take a big, gigantic step back and deconstruct it. And it's interesting and then it becomes a question. In other words, what function does the urbanization or localization of that problem serve politically and ideologically? So that would be one. The second, and maybe somewhat more speculative consequence of this approach is that, and again, this will be an experiment. We'll see what we can do together, those of you who work with me at the school in the time ahead. But the consequence is that, and I don't think I'm the only person making this argument, but in different ways, other people, Eve, others are making this argument, but it's basically an explosion of scales. So that the design, architectural, and planning problems that I think have to be on our agenda in the school cannot only or should not only be embedded within local built environments. For me, the world economy is a design and planning problem. The global environmental crisis is a design and planning problem and an architectural problem. It's a problem of the built environment. It doesn't mean that it's only global, but that's a scale that needs to be a reference point for the work that we're doing in the school. So it doesn't mean only, in the same way that I'm saying let's not fetishize the urban, we shouldn't fetishize the global. We shouldn't bend the stick all the way in that direction either. But essentially the orientation opens up to be much more mundane, towards very large-scale planning and design problems, be it a mega region, be it a seaboard, a continent, a corridor, the EU, NAFTA, with the globe as an omnipresent, or the world, I should say, as an omnipresent horizon for thinking about what we're doing. And again, that needs fleshing out, but that's the sort of direction, not just large scale, but multiscalar. So multiscalar means that you're also presupposing and investigating the crystallization of, as it were, smaller scales as a constitutive part of the analysis. But by the same token, in looking at the smaller scales, the local, the regional, et cetera, you do so in a way that is relationally attuned to their embeddedness within a very large-scale system. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you very much.